Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the Academy to the community to help think about real-world matters. A process of ideological soul-searching is not unusual after a political party loses an election. But it has been particularly challenging for Democrats after losing their traditional blue-collar base to Donald Trump in several key states, which cost them the election. Today we're going to talk about the Democratic Party's internal struggle to find direction after losing the presidential election. Joining me to help us look at this is Dr. Seth Maskett, who is a professor of political science at the University of Denver and leads the university's Center on American Politics. Dr. Maskett is both a highly regarded teacher and an extraordinary scholar with special expertise in political parties. He is the author of 2 books, over 35 articles. In addition, he also writes for the New York Times, Vox, Politico, and other popular publications. Professor Seth Maskett, welcome to Engaging Ideas.
Thank you.
We know that internal self-analysis occurs within political parties after they lose a presidential election or have a major setback in congressional elections. Is there a difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the way that each approaches such an examination?
Yes, definitely. So the Democrats are, as you noted, in the middle of this period of kind of self-analysis or even self-flagellation. This is not unusual for a party to go through shortly after losing a presidential race, particularly a close one. There's a book on this topic, actually. Phil Klinkner, a political scientist, wrote a book called The Losing Parties that focuses on how the major parties react after losing an election, and looks at basically pretty much every election since World War II, and more or less categorizes things into 2 different approaches across the 2 parties. Republicans, when they lose, tend to focus on what we might call nuts and bolts reforms. That is, maybe there's some part of the country we could be spending more on or less on. There's some new initiatives we should be funding, some new campaign techniques we should be experimenting with. The Democratic approach tends to be somewhat different. They tend to look internally and decide, is our party being run properly? Is the party too democratic or not democratic enough? That is, do party leaders have enough say in the major parties' decisions, or do they have too much say? Should the party's rank and file, the regular voters, the delegates, should they be given more of a say in the party's major decisions about what stances should be taken and who should be nominated for president and other offices? And there's ideological battles built into this as well. That is, should the party be moving to the left or to the right, or should it be more centrist? That is, should it be embracing the more extreme views of its activist base, or should it be trying to move to the center where many voters are perceived as being?
As you've said, the Democratic Party is going through this. As they're in this process of discovery and debate, what kind of core values might they be thinking about and discussing?
So there are core values at stake here. I find a really instructive example to think about what Democrats went through during and right after 1968. Okay, so 1968 was famously saw one of the most divisive and really bad major party conventions that we've ever seen in this country. So the Democrats going into that year, President Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for re-election. He was seen as very unpopular, was concerned he couldn't win. He chose to back his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. But there was a strong anti-war left contingent in the Democratic Party. They were opposing the Vietnam War. They were concerned that Johnson and Humphrey were continuing to support the war. They were backing candidates like Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy before he was assassinated. And Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy were doing very well in the primaries and caucuses that they were participating in. Nonetheless, we get to the convention, and the party decides to nominate Hubert Humphrey, who had supported the war and had not entered a single primary. You could do that back then. The primaries were not determinative of these sorts of things, but this was outrageous to the activists who saw the party as completely ignoring them, and they were demoralized. Meanwhile, you have anti-war protests going on outside the convention halls. You have the Chicago police massively overreacting to that and leading to a great deal of violence in the streets. Some of that violence spills into the convention halls, and you have a very bitter and divided party going into the fall election, where the activist base is really dissatisfied with the nominee that they has. The party's divided. They end up losing to Richard Nixon, something that a lot of people thought was impossible at that time. So, this is, I think, an important model going forward. But, shortly after that, Democrats decide this was a horrible moment for their party and they need to make changes. They immediately convene a commission to discuss, okay, what direction should we be heading, what reform should we be making. This is ultimately called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. And you see the party start to debate internally some really core values and question some long-standing assumptions in the party. But what you end up is seeing is an important conflict within the party. Okay, so there are some who say that, well, the problem is that basically the same white men have been making the same decisions for the party for decades now. And what we need is to recognize the people who are sort of in our activist community, African Americans, young people, women, who have been doing a lot of work for the party but aren't really represented among its delegates or its candidates. So they say we need to come up with a system where the party better represents the very diverse group of people who make it up. You have another group of people who are arguing that the problem is that we have essentially, very predictable outcomes. We end up with the same sorts of nominees all the time. What we need is to have less predictable outcomes. We need to open up the convention system to primaries and caucuses and just let regular voters in to, make things, less predictable, more interesting. You'll get a different set of candidates showing up. So these are two very interesting directions, but they're actually in many ways in conflict with each other. If you want clearly defined outcomes like greater representation of African Americans, of women, of young people, then you don't want things less predictable, and vice versa. So, those two end up really kind of competing with each other. And we're seeing in some ways the same sort of debates among Democrats today. So over the last year, there's been an internal party effort to discuss what's wrong with the party and where it needs to go. There's been a unity reform commission within the Democratic Party consisting of both Bernie Sanders supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters who've been meeting over the last year and arguing over what the best direction for the party is. And they've been arguing about these same sorts of things. Some are saying what we need is a more open and unpredictable process. We need open primaries. We need things to be open to independents, people who are not registered with the Democratic Party. We need less predictable outcomes. And others who are saying, no, well, what the party is missing and what it was missing in 2016 was that it wasn't really adequately representing the women, the African Americans, the Latinos, the LGBT community who make up many of its core supporters. So the party is still having the same argument it's been having for at least half a century now.
And it seems to me that potential candidates would be watching these discussions very closely. In the current Democratic Party process, can you give us some examples of individuals and folks who would be particularly engaged in this from their own self-interest and potential candidacy point of view? Sure.
Well, to get into that, I think it's helpful to think about just what the party's arguing about right now. And in some ways, they are having an internal argument about just why they lost in 2016. And different candidates are making different arguments along these lines. So, this was obviously a very close election, but Hillary Clinton was ahead of Donald Trump in the polls for basically the whole year. The loss came as a real surprise to most observers. And so there's a big argument about, well, why did that fall apart for the Democrats? One argument that has been made is that this was because the party, and Hillary Clinton particularly, were too focused on what's sometimes called identity politics. Okay, identity politics usually means the party was too focused on the specific needs of constituent groups within the party, women, African Americans, the LGBT community, and so forth, and didn't paint a larger picture that all Americans might rally behind. I'm not saying that this argument is necessarily correct or incorrect, but it's simply one interpretation of the election that has gained some traction. And I've been curious about, what are the consequences of, adopting one interpretation of the election as opposed to another. So I've been actually doing some research on this. So I ran a survey experiment in which I asked several hundred people to evaluate 6 different potential Democratic presidential candidates for 2020. Some of them were, I had 2 white male candidates, I had 2 white female candidates, and 2 African American male candidates. Half the people who took this test saw an identity politics interpretation of the last election, and half were in a control condition. They didn't see any political message beforehand. And interestingly, those who saw this identity politics message evaluated the women and the African American candidates lower than those who didn't see that message. So, this isn't a huge effect, but it's, the interpretation there is that by, hearing and believing this identity politics argument, that tends to make one want to nominate a white male next time around at the expense of other candidates. This would suggest that, if the party, tends to adopt that framework, that identity politics argument, that may advantage possibly a white male candidate, or that a white male candidate would have a little bit of a leg up there. So
somebody like Bernie Sanders, for example, might be advantaged by that?
Possibly. And this is an argument that I've seen in some of my other research that some political activists in states like Iowa and New Hampshire seem to be taking to heart, that they're thinking that maybe we do need someone like Bernie Sanders or another white male candidate. Interestingly, some of the other reforms that the party has been considering adopting over the course of the last year, open primaries, fewer superdelegates, and so forth, trying to give party insiders less power and giving regular voters more power, would also, tend to advantage someone who's maybe not as popular among Democratic Party insiders. Again, someone like Bernie Sanders, even if not necessarily him. Right. He might have a bit more of an advantage going into the next cycle than he did last time around. And really, this is consistent with what the party did right after 1968. That argument that the party needed to be more open to its rank and file kind of won the day after 1968. You had this explosion of the number of primaries. Those were more predictive of what happened in the nomination process. And the party ends up nominating George McGovern, someone who was seen as a fairly far left activist, someone who did not have a lot of allies within the party in D.C., and he went on to get trounced by Richard Nixon in the 1972 election.
Right. So looking beyond the current debate, this current debate, are there other implications to these 4-year internal skirmish kinds of activities that go on? What's happened historically in that regard?
So we can see some examples of where a party has an interpretation and makes some reforms after a loss that actually go on to affect subsequent elections pretty substantially. So I mentioned George McGovern's example. He went on to lose in 1972. The Democratic Party had similar set of rules in place going into the next cycle, 1976, and they ended up nominating Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter's certainly not seen as any far left-wing radical or anything like that, but he also is someone without any real ties to the party in D.C. He was more or less unknown outside of Georgia. He does win the presidential election, but as a result of his lack of ties to the party, he doesn't have a very consequential presidency. He's not able to sign many longstanding Democratic priorities into law, and he goes on to lose his re-election bid in 1980. So party leaders get together after that, and they figure maybe it's time that the party leadership actually influences things a little bit more. That they want to reassert their own role in picking presidential candidates. And one of the things that comes out of that is the creation of superdelegates, which are simply elected Democratic officials and members of the Democratic National Committee who are just automatically given a vote in the Democratic national conventions over who the presidential and vice presidential nominees will be. So this way party insiders are able to reassert their voice a little bit. And so that has big consequences for the party down the road. Later on in the 1980s, the party is concerned that, after they've lost 3 times in a row at the presidential level, they're concerned that their nominees are seen as too liberal. And so one of the things that they do after that is to create the so-called Super Tuesday primaries. This is to essentially put most or all of the Southern primaries on one day, kind of magnifying the voice of the Southern part of the party, which tends to be more conservative. 1992, Bill Clinton gets nominated for president, coming out of that system. So you end up with a more centrist and Southern face for the party. You can even see this going on a little bit on the Republican side. So, for example, after 2012, Mitt Romney loses narrowly to Barack Obama, and Republicans have their kind of famous post-mortem after that, trying to examine what went wrong with their party and why they were unable to win that year. And one of the things they decide is that, well, we simply have too many primary debates. We're coming out of, we had 21 primary debates in the last few cycles, which are basically like meaning that we had a candidate who was our favorite, but everyone else just beats him up for too long. And they do adopt that reform. So going into 2016, they roughly halve the number of primary debates that they have. They also come out of that year saying, part of our problem is that we've been bashing immigrants too much, and we need to stop doing that, and we need to embrace this growing sector of the electorate. And notably, their next nominee, Donald Trump, goes completely the other direction on that, and he sort of goes all in on very overt immigrant bashing. Still manages to win. It's hard to know whether, had he gone another direction, would he have won a greater share of the vote, or might he not have even become the presidential nominee? It's hard to know from that, but very clearly, what the party is considering at any given point will have some ramifications in the next few cycles after that.
Is there any, as the pendulum seems to swing from time to time to the sort of identity type candidate or the more centrist candidate, is there any pattern of winning that's been associated with that? Has one approach worked better than the other, or is it idiosyncratic?
That's the funny thing, is that it's hard to point to a direct victory resulting from this. For example, we go back to 1972. Had Democrats picked a more conventional nominee than George McGovern, would that person have won? Probably not. They might have done a little better than George McGovern did, but a president running for re-election in a growing economy almost always wins. Things like whether the economy is growing, whether we're at war or peace, tend to have a much bigger impact on elections than any little tinkering that the party does. But we're talking about effects like on the margins here.
Yes.
If the party's at 49% of the vote, could they get to 50 if they have a slightly better nominee? And the chances, maybe the answer is yes there.
We've been talking about the Democratic Party, but it strikes me that the Republican Party may, at this moment in time, be going through a little soul searching itself, albeit perhaps not as overtly. What kinds of things generically and typically might a party that finds itself in the position of the Republican Party today, where they're in power, but there seems to be this turmoil going on, what kinds of things would a party in that circumstance maybe think about?
So, I mean, what the Republican Party went through in 2016 and continues to go through now, it's a pretty fascinating time for them. And when all the assumptions were that Trump was going to lose, a lot of people were expecting that the Republican Party was due for some serious soul searching.
Right.
They had seen, in many ways, Trump's nomination was very different from the process we normally see. He was definitely not the one that most party insiders had wanted. Very few people had endorsed him, and he managed to win anyway. And it seemed like they were, and he was someone who, not only did he seem outlandish in many ways, but he also, his policy stances weren't where the party were on a lot of things, Social Security to the military to Medicare and everything else. So in many ways, that's a dangerous position for a party to be in. It wouldn't have surprised me if the party had moved to even create some sort of superdelegate system in their side, which the Democrats have had for a number of years now, just so that party insiders could push back a little bit when they saw party voters heading off in a different direction. The fact that they actually ended up winning with that candidate makes that a somewhat more complex set of assumptions. And policy-wise, they're more or less getting what they wanted out of Donald Trump. But he is also, through his behavior, making himself unpopular and making his party unpopular, and that could be very costly for it in the next round of elections. So I think they, that party may be doing some similar soul searching along these lines, but I think it's been delayed somewhat. We'll see what happens in 2020 or maybe 2024.
Well, it's a fascinating process and a fascinating discussion, and Seth Maskett, thanks so much for joining us. This is one of those it remains to be seen kinds of things, but we certainly appreciate your letting us look a little bit behind the curtain at the kinds of discussions that go on in political parties. I hope you'll join us in the future as we bring more engaging ideas from the Academy to the community. I'm Jim Grismer. Thank you for watching.